Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, taking your lunch hour with us. My name is Michelle Beltran. I have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started with today's content. So, coming on Tuesday, April 28th, in honor of Workers' Memorial Day, we have the California Labor Lab presents Work is Changing, Are Protections Keeping Up? This is a hybrid event that'll be available in person in Sacramento and online. You can also learn more about upcoming webinars at californialaborlab.ucsf.edu/webinars. And on behalf of the California Labor Lab and NIOSH Center of Excellence for Total Worker Health, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. I do have a few housekeeping announcements. You are going to be muted during this presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, we invite you to enter it into the online Q&A box, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the California Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page in the next 5 business days. And also, all participants who logged in today for the full live presentation with your email address will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form, and that will qualify you for a certificate of completion with 1 continuing education contact hour. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. And just a couple of more slides here just to highlight Total Worker Health is a registered trademark of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Our funding is from NIOSH as a part of the Total Worker Health program. And our mission is to extend the pursuit of health and safety for workers. Here is a slide about our upcoming event on April 28th. This is available both in person and online. We'll be in Sacramento and online. And we really do hope that you can join us all there. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Victor, who is our moderator for today, and we'll be introducing our panelists. Thank you. Oh, Victor, it seems we've lost your audio. Oops, sorry about that, everyone. We're just going to quick troubleshoot. He's reconnecting to audio. Thank you.
Okay, how's that?
Yes, we can hear you now. Oh, we could, and then you muted yourself. All right,
Right.
excellent.
Let's try that again.
I think one of you will need to turn off the speaker on your computer. So your mic, you want to have your mic on, but the speaker off.
All right, can we try that again?
Great,
How's that?
perfect.
All right. Thank you to everyone who's making this work. We're going to talk about surveys. And on the one hand, it's an incredibly technically sophisticated business. On the other hand, there's something old-fashioned about just talking to people one at a time and getting to hear their true attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and experiences. We're in an age of artificial intelligence and concurrently an age of incredibly big data sets where we often hear about researchers having millions or even tens of millions of records. However, they may have obtained them legally or questionably. But there's something still ineffably important about the experiences that people have that they convey to researchers. And there's something incredibly important and sophisticated about gathering rigorous samples to understand a diverse population. So we're going to talk with some of the leading survey researchers in California about work and health and how we survey those in an era of cell phones, in an era of people living their lives online, to see what's familiar and what's new about the business of surveying. We're going to talk a little about work and health, how the Labor Lab, of course, is devoted to the questions of how in a world where work itself is changing, everything from benefits to job security to shift and hours to working conditions, and the very idea of whether someone is an employee or a contractor, and what those implications are for health. So, our speakers have a variety of experiences with some uh, various survey methods that have been around for a while but are adapting to all these circumstances. We're going to hear first from Edward Yellen, who's emeritus professor at UCSF and director of the California Labor Lab, which, as you saw, is a NIOSH Center of Excellence in Total Worker Health and part of the Centers for Disease Control, and still moving ahead. Then we'll hear from Todd Hughes. Todd is the director of the California Health Interview Survey, which is housed at the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research, and before he came to the CHIS, as it's known, about 10 years ago, worked for many years at the U.S. Census Bureau. And finally, we'll hear from Mark Baldassari, statewide survey director and Miller Chair in Public Policy at the Public Policy Institute of California. Previously, Mark had been the president and CEO of PPIC, as well as director of research and senior fellow. And I actually met him even before all of that, when he was a professor of social ecology at UC Irvine. Good to see you again, Mark, and nice to meet you, Todd. And Ed, as always, since I have a small role in the Labor Lab, I'm always happy to be able to contribute. So we'll go in the order in which I just mentioned people. Ed first, Todd second, and Mark third. There's a Q&A function on your Zoom link for the webinar, and there's a chat, and we'll make sure we get back to your queries and comments later on in the hour. But for now, with that general theme that we're in an incredibly rapidly changing world, but that it's no less important, and maybe even more important, to do good survey research in this area, we'll ask our panelists to weigh in on that. Ed?
Okay, thanks. Victor, yeah. Can everybody hear me now? I will share my screen, and when I do, hope everyone can see my slides. And just want to echo some of the things that Victor said. I've worked with Victor for way too long. But actually, I've met Mark when he was a graduate student in sociology at Berkeley, and he may not remember that, but he's a couple years ahead of me. And now we're both with a little bit of gray hair at least. And Todd, welcome to our webinar today. Long-term fans of CHIS and what, since the days that Rick Brown started it, and with you and Inez and your team, just in awe of what you've accomplished there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the California Work and Health Survey, something that I was involved in its initial go-round at the dawn of the millennium, and that we are replicating through our California Labor Lab grant. I don't know if I can advance the slides. There. So just a little context for what the survey is about. Many analysts have looked at the labor market and see this, as Victor was saying, has undergone profound changes in the ways that people are hired to work. For much of the first decades after the Second World War, the workplace was characterized by high rates of unionization and what we call traditional work, with full-time, full-year employment for a single employer, with formal hiring and full benefits. There have been, as our center is focused on, new modes of hiring people to do work that explicitly diffuse responsibility for worker welfare to the worker. Part of what Jacob Hacker at Yale calls the great risk shift. But some of the signposts are not unique to this era. Seasonal and task or project-based employment have always existed. In California, they've existed in the context of the agricultural industry and ironically also in the entertainment industry, where you may be paid big bucks to work on a movie, but then not work for a long time afterwards. In the California Labor Lab, we are focused on three axes by which work is changing. The use of alternative employment rate arrangements, the largest of which is independent contracting, people paid by a 1099, on-call work, day labor and the like, being employed by a temp agency and having work subcontracted out. We also focus on the use of contingent forms of employment, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines in several ways as work that will not last beyond the current year. And a third axis is the erosion of workplace benefits and protections that arose in the 20th century, including formal ways of providing workers with a voice over their own work activities. So the aims of our survey were to document the extent of these kinds of employment, to capture data sufficient to test the hypotheses that these forms of work may be episodic and/or they may be in second jobs, and tie these new forms of work to health status and economic outcome. Do they help or hurt the workers? A lot of the firms that use these forms of employer talk about how this can be family friendly, can offer people flexibility in hours, and some of that is true, but it only becomes a viable form of employment for most of us if it allows you to live a good life with sufficient sufficient income to raise your family and not be poor. So in order to do our survey, there were several problems that we had to overcome to address those aims. One is the bifurcation of U.S. data system. The Census Bureau collects labor market data for the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the current population survey and in the supplements, but with very little health information. They basically ask how you're doing. On the other hand, the National Center for Health Statistics collects information in its National Health Interview Survey and other surveys, but with very little labor market information. They ask if you're working in your occupation and industry. So in what we wanted to accomplish, what were the requirements? We had to correct the limitation in labor market surveys by collecting data on jobs held in the week and month prior to interview in both main and second jobs. We need to collect almost as much data on the nature of work as the BLS surveys and add information on potential misclassification of workers as contractors, because firms like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and TaskRabbit say that they don't hire people, that these are solely people who choose to access customers through their websites. We need to collect almost as much health information as the National Center for Health Statistics survey so we can relate how work affects health. And like every other survey that takes place in California, we want to represent the state of California's working age population as well as possible. And I'm sure the others will touch on this too. One of the facts of life for people doing survey work is it's much harder to get samples. people, willingness of people to respond to surveys using cold calling has declined precipitously. On the other hand, while new technologies enable new ways of reaching them. So we did a smaller version of California Work and Health Survey at the dawn of the millennium. And for that, we used random digit dialing among landlines. And there are many people in this audience who will say, what is a landline? We therefore needed to transition to cell phones, which don't solve the problem of low participation rates, but it does enable ability to sell participation either by a live interview, by offering people the opportunity to complete the survey on the web. So it doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves one of them. And we'll point out here that survey information that's available indicate that 98% of working age Californians, which for our survey is people 18 to 70, have a cell phone. And for many, it's their only way to access the World Wide Web. So 98% is pretty good coverage. So what did we do? We used a dual frame, dual data collection method. And at this point, it's would be valuable to shout out to our partners at David Research for suggesting using cell phone listings to collect respondents, but not necessarily to rely on the cell phone for administering the interviews. So we, through them, purchased cell phone listings of two kinds. The traditional plans that most of us have, where we're billed once a month for our plans, and so-called prepaid plans, which are more common among people who don't have the credit history to for the companies be willing to wait a month to get their money. Prepaid plans are you basically pay in advance for the use of the phone. We used the cell phone when we got somebody on the line to inform participants about the survey and that they would be reimbursed for participation. When people agreed to the survey, of those who agreed, 2/3 did the survey on the web, the rest by survey interview. With the exception that older workers were more likely to do theirs by interview, there were no other differences. Another advantage of cell phones is it results in simplified weighting. Cell phones are individual devices, so sampling weights do not have to incorporate clustering within households. For those of us old enough to have done landline surveys, you first reach a house, then you use some protocol to decide who within the house you're going to interview. After we reached an individual with the cell phones and we were finished with the interviews, California Work and Health Survey is otherwise weighted to the California population using the American Community Survey. The biggest difference between the weighted and unweighted samples is in education. The survey captured a higher proportion of those with high levels of education, so that needed to be downweighted to represent California better. This is probably a common tale that survey researchers told. We dialed 135,000 numbers, no contacts with 92,000, 28,000 were non-working phones, reached 15,000 people, of whom 2,000 were ineligible, 9,000 said, get out of here, and 4,000 completed our interviews. So 26% of contacts made and something like 3 or 4% of the phone numbers attempted. So one of the advantages of cell phones is it improves our ability to follow individuals longitudinally. Cell phone numbers remain with most individuals, resulting in improved ability to retain respondents over time. In 2024-25, we interviewed respondents who were on pace to successfully do second data collection with 2/3 or more. Unfortunately, due to the problems in federal funding, we had to halt data collection midstream. And for that, we have regrets, but we were quite successful in retaining people for the follow-up interviews. So what did we find from expanding the time frame from the past week to the past month and the scope from main to second jobs? An radically increased yield in people in alternative forms of employment. We increased the yield of people who were actually working by 6%, and for independent contractors by 28%, in all forms of alternative work by more than a third, for contingent labor by 46%, and for app-based labor by 42%. So the methods make a huge difference in how many of these people you find. Much non-standard employment is hiding in second jobs and episodic work. Yet most of these non-standard jobs are the respondents' main employment. Around 80% of non-standard employment is the main job for the individual. Substantial numbers of working Californians report financial strain. That may not be news to my colleagues from the other surveys, but non-standard employment is associated with lower earnings, poverty level household income, and public benefit recipiency. I should also add with reports of wage theft. In terms of the relationship between non-standard work and health, the associations of non-standard work with health are less pronounced than with financial well-being. And this may be because many chronic conditions have long latency periods, and that necessitates looking at risk factors for onset rather than the prevalence of the conditions themselves. We did find that non-standard employment was associated with several working conditions, which are known to elevate the risk of occupational mediated diseases, such as high levels of ergonomic demands, irregular shifts, and jobs with high demands and low levels of control, which epidemiologists call job strain. So summary, cell phones are a reasonable way of representing the working age population. They may be used to do sampling, but data collection can be done by interview or on web. Make waiting simpler because they are individual devices and are a reasonable way of maintaining connections after an initial interview. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and turn it back to Victor.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Wait, just I need to.
Yeah, we're in the same room here,
Yeah.
so he needs to turn
I'm
down.
off now.
All right. Thank you so much. And there's, I want to remind folks that there's a Q&A. You can add questions. We have one in there right now, which we'll make sure we'll get to. But we want to have our other panelists go ahead. Todd, how has the CHIS adapted, and how do you see these questions of both access and sampling and quality of responses on the changing world of work? The floor is yours. Thank you. This is Todd Hughes from the UCLA and the California Health Interview Survey.
Great. Thank you, Victor. And thank you all for the opportunity to take some of your time today and share a little bit of the work that we're doing on CHIS to address some of these issues. Prior to coming to UCLA, I did spend 20 years at the U.S. Census Bureau working on a couple things that Ed mentioned, a couple of years on the current population survey and many years on the leadership of the American Community Survey. So survey research has been my career, my life. And I'm happy to share some of the things we've been doing the last 10 years here in California for the California Health Interview Survey. All right, so if you're a little less familiar with CHIS because you're highly focused on labor-related issues, I'll give you a brief overview. So the CHIS is the nation's largest ongoing state population health survey. It was implemented initially in 2001 as the brainchild of Dr. Rick Brown. who was looking for a way to get more detailed state-based information than what the National Health Interview Survey was providing for states. And so after our implementation, we have been the most comprehensive source for detailed information on the health of Californians. And that includes a number of different topics. We are a bit of an omnibus health survey, as you can see by some of the topics that are displayed here on this slide, which include employment. Though admittedly, it is a limited set of employment questions that are asked on the CHIS. But health insurance and health behaviors, access and use of healthcare are really the core bread and butter topics of the CHIS. But we have a lot of other topics that do come and go from CHIS cycle to cycle, depending on the needs of our various funders. It is a collaborative funded project. We have about a dozen different funding organizations that have different priorities, and that includes a majority of our funding coming from state health agencies, but also various nonprofit organizations and foundations, as well as others. So in essence, the CHIS focuses on interviewing up to 3 different components of each household. So we start with a screener to understand the composition of the household, and then we select one adult within that household for interview. We use a next birthday sampling mechanism to identify that sample adult. And if that adult is the parent of any children in the household, then we will select one adolescent age 12 to 17 to ask that parent's permission for to complete an interview with them. And if there are children age 0 to 11 in the household, then we will conduct a proxy interview with the parent about that selected sample child. So the sequence then is we do the screener, we will conduct the sample child interview through the parent proxy, then do the long sample adult interview, followed by a separate contact with the adolescent directly for self-response for their own questionnaire. We do this in multiple languages to reflect the diversity of California's population that are listed here below. And we're excited that this year we have added Armenian language response options to the mix of the California Health Interview Survey. The design of the CHIS is intended to produce sub-state estimates each year for California. And the wish would be to do that at the county level for each county, but for the 17 smallest population counties, we group those into 3 multi-county strata, as shown on this map. There are 2 counties for which we do sub-county strata in our sample design to produce estimates each year for the 8 service planning areas in Los Angeles County, as well as the 6 health regions in San Diego. And then the balance of the 39 counties each form their own individual strata for estimates each year. We do also have some modeled estimates that we produce. When we pool 2 years of data for some of the CHIS indicators, we go all the way down to the census tract level in producing small area estimated indicators for California's health. So historically, the CHIS had been initially designed as a random digit dial telephone survey. And for the first 18 years of its existence, that included first, landlines only, and then we started to integrate cell phone numbers, and then we had different proportions of landline versus cell phone numbers that were making up our sample. But we started to really feel the pain of those declining response rates. The cost of obtaining interviews by telephone was really growing in painful ways from year to year for the CHIS. And we were getting more and more concerned about the non-response bias among those groups that tend not to participate in telephone surveys. And so that really led us to experiment in 2018 with 2 different tests that led towards a redesign. And both of those tests explored an address-based sampling frame using mail as the primary contact method, but allowing for web and telephone response options, including telephone follow-up. So we did these experiments in 2018 in parallel with our production CHIS data collection, but using independent samples so that we could compare some of the data that we collected from the new methods. So what did those data collection methods involve? It's here depicted visually on this slide. So phase 1 was a series of 4 mailings to try to encourage the respondent to participate by web. So those mailings included instructions for selecting the sample adult and provided information for them to go online to complete the survey, and also provided a telephone number for them to complete the survey by phone if that was their preference or if they did not have internet access. After that sequence of 4 mailings, then we followed up. If we were able to match the address to a telephone number, we then made outbound calls to that telephone number from our call centers with a total of up to 6 different call attempts to attempt to persuade them to conduct the interview by telephone. What did we learn from those experiments? Well, we definitely achieved higher response rates. Initially, our first test in the spring of 2018 was in 3 counties, and then we expanded that to a statewide test in the fall, and both of those showed improvements over the CADI-only design for response rates. And importantly, it also led to significant decreases in the cost per completed interview compared to the prior design. And we also did an evaluation of what our survey estimates showed under the different methods to understand the potential impact on our data. And we did see that using the web and telephone, we obtained a different population than using telephone alone. They were younger in general and therefore healthier respondents. They were also better educated. There were fewer foreign-born and fewer non-English speakers. And we saw that using that telephone mode was essential still in adjusting our estimates by obtaining some of those less well-represented groups, including older adults and less healthy respondents. That also led us to making some future design enhancements to address some of those differences. But this set of maps just gives you a quick indication of, so what happened to response rates when we made this mode switch in our fall 2018 statewide experiment. The darker the blue, the higher the response, the darker the red, the lower the response. So in most areas, we saw improvements, especially in urban areas that were becoming more and more challenging to conduct telephone interviewing. Those moved into the blue range. We had a couple of counties that were exceptions where they moved even lower on the low end, and that was Kern County and Imperial County. But generally, in the more populated areas, the new design was an improvement, and the loss in response in the more rural areas was limited in some areas, and overall, we felt the design was worthwhile. We published a series of analyses and reports on what that mode switch would bring to our survey estimates. So we definitely rely on sample weighting, and we control the factors, as Ed mentioned, also using American Community Survey and census data as control factors in our weighting design to make sure that we're reflecting the population well. But we felt assured based on these analyses of individual indicators that users would be able to trend most variables. There were a few variables where when you switch from a self-response using a web interview versus a telephone administered version of the question, that the design of the question had to change substantially. And so some questions we express some caution about trending historically, but that's all available on our methodology reports repository at healthpolicy.ucla.edu. So what have we done since then, and how is CHIS reflecting California's diversity? I'll talk in a while about some of the targeted sampling methods that we use. I've shared what the importance of our multi-mode data collection is in reflecting that diversity. Language support is essential, and I'll talk about some strategies we use for different languages. We also have this opportunity then with 20,000 interviews, 20,000 adult interviews each year in the CHIS. We do get some respondents with rarer characteristics, and that creates an opportunity for us to do a couple of things. Number one, we can target certain oversamples in geographic areas or for certain demographic subgroups, but we also have this ability for follow-on studies where we use the CHIS respondent pool essentially as a frame for later studies. And sometimes those studies are piggybacked right onto the end of the CHIS questionnaire where we do another 10 or 15 or 20-minute survey at the end of the CHIS survey. Sometimes we contact those CHIS respondents back to do qualitative interviews on, specific topics like hate incidents. And sometimes we can use these follow-on studies in kind of new and exciting ways. We're preparing for a partnership with CDPH biomonitoring to look at doing some collection for exposure to pollutants from CHIS respondents as well in coming years. So a number of opportunities to leverage the CHIS sample for researchers who are looking for those more detailed, rarer subgroups. One of the things that we implemented to address some of the shift in characteristics of our redesign of respondents using our redesign was to implement a prepaid cell phone sample as a supplemental sampling frame to the address-based sample design. So this runs in parallel with the CHIS address-based sample. We select a set of cell phone numbers with a target of 450 completes on top of the 20,000 CHIS interviews we do each year. But really, we focus that prepaid cell phone sample on those who meet the characteristics on this slide: young adult, Hispanic or Latinx, Black or African American, or those who prefer to do the survey in a language other than English. And these have been very helpful to ensure that we're getting some additional data from those groups. We also rely on predictive modeling in our sample design and in the determination of our mail strategy. At the start of the webinar today, Victor mentioned, the power of big data and, the threat of big data, perhaps, instead of survey data. But this is a way in which the two can kind of combine their powers in a useful way. So we append the address-based sample design frame with third-party consumer information, voter registration, and demographic data from census and ACS to really model the predicted likelihood of an individual address having certain characteristics. And then we can put those into different sampling strata and sample those predicted likelihoods of addresses at different rates. So we can oversample from households that we feel are likely to have characteristics that would be underrepresented in the CHIS. And then we can sample a little lower for households that we feel maybe are, very cooperative and might be overrepresented in the CHIS. So we really target and customize our sample design to ensure that we're getting a very representative statewide sample. We also have used these approaches in targeting certain language mailings that are sent based on the predicted likelihood of them having the attributes here on the left side of these bottom few bullets. And that really determines whether we send them an Asian dominant mailing, a Spanish dominant mailing, or a standard English mailing. And just to give you a quick sense of what that looks like. So, the biggest challenge in an address-based sample design with the mail push to web is getting them to open the envelope. And so having messages in targeted languages for the predicted needs of that address have been important to encourage respondents to open them and know that they will find support in the language of their need. That applies as well to what's inside the materials. So here, example, inside of a fold pressure sealed postcard, that's one of our mailings. Spanish dominant households predicted to need to benefit from Spanish materials have Spanish language messaging at the top of the postcard, English at the bottom. Our Asian dominant treatment has all of the CHIS supported languages and all of the Asian languages presented. So really customizing the contact strategies to meet the predicted needs of the household. And then we also have experimented with other things like having visible cash through a cutout window on the outside of the envelope. It's been shown time and time again that an incentive like a $2 bill is highly motivating to encourage response. But if they don't open the envelope, we can't take advantage of that. So a little window that lets you know, hey, there's money in this thing. I shouldn't just put it directly in the trash, does encourage respondents to open the envelope and then make a decision about whether they would like to participate. And then in the current CHIS cycle, we're experimenting with some additional things that are highlighted here on the screen. We've added QR codes to our letters to make it easier to connect to the CHIS web survey. We're changing the design of some questions, experimenting with that to reduce straight lining that can occur. when in a matrix or grid design, sometimes respondents put a little less cognitive effort and go straight down the column. We were also experimenting with text messaging, both the ABS design and the prepaid sample, before we start making phone calls, to see if a text message with a link to go online nudges some of them to complete the survey before we start making those phone calls. And then finally, we're experimenting with modifications to our parental permission approach for adolescent respondents. And we've also implemented the OMB SPD 15 2024 revisions for the collection of race and ethnicity. And we're getting ready to release our 2025 data this fall that will include both the new guidelines as well as some mapping back to the old design, which is necessary for the weighting using the ACS data, et cetera. So lots of exciting things always happening at CHIS, and look forward to being able to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And indeed, questions are coming in on the Q&A. We're up to about 5 of them. I want to have Mark present first, and then we'll get back to those, but I believe our panelists can look at those and sort of get ready. My introduction to this whole business was in the 1970 census. I had come back from my freshman year of college, the first year that the census was done by mail, so the only door-to-door was with people who had not returned it. So I walked the streets of the South Bronx and got both motivated and educated in a way that stuck with me throughout my career. And I hope whatever happens, that everybody gets that kind of on-the-ground experience, whatever the contemporary version of that is. Mark, thanks for joining us. Please orient us to how PPIC looks at these questions.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me today, Ed, and it's nice to see you again. And Victor, good to see you again. And Todd, great to hear about CHIS, which is one of my favorite surveys in California. So I wanted to spend a few minutes so that we'll have more time for questions. I will keep my answers and comments brief and would also welcome you to, instead of having slides, to go, when you have a chance, go to the ppic.org/survey website, where you'll see every report, or crosstabs, or time trends for those reports. A section called Survey Data, which has the data files from every survey that has ever been conducted as part of the PPIC statewide survey. And under About the Center, there is a more detailed description of the methodology than we have in our reports every time. And I guess in reference to why we have all that information online, for us, transparency has always been very important. We're very pleased to have a high rating, not just for the election accuracy of our polls, but for what our colleagues describe as a process that's very transparent, which is very important to us, given the values of PPIC and also the issues that all of us face in who are doing public opinion research. The PPIC statewide survey has been conducted since April 1998. So I started the survey at that time with the goal of being a voice for the public, to inform policymakers, to encourage discussion, and to raise awareness about critical issues facing California. We reach out to a lot of people in the course of doing the surveys, but at the end of the day, we make the final determination on the methods, the questions, the content of the PPIC survey, which originally was launched as through using live telephone interviews. And for about 20 years, that was our sole methodology, was random digit dial and live telephone interviews. Over time, we moved from English only to English and Spanish, and then over time from landline to landline and cell phone samples. But in 2018, we started experimenting with online panels. Always our goal in conducting the survey is to use whatever is considered the gold standard in our industry. So we looked around at what other national what national surveys were doing, and how they were ranked and rated, and always use them as kind of the model for what we wanted to do. And in 2018, we started working with Ipsos and the Knowledge Panel. We did one survey a year using online surveys, and starting that year, and beginning with the uh, beginning in 2024, we for our election-related surveys started using online panels. We do about 7 surveys a year, usually. One survey, which would be of particular interest to this group, we started in 2020, which is specifically on economic well-being. We have an oversample of lower income Californians in that survey. That's done towards the end of the year every year. 4 times a year, we do something called the Californians and their government survey, which is during election years. It's more election related, but it covers a range of state and national issues. And then once a year, starting in 2000, we started an environment survey, which we do every July. And starting in 2006, we did an annual survey on education, which will be coming out next month, at the end of next month, about a month from now, specifically on education issues. But let me talk a little bit about the methodology, with the example being our latest survey, which was released in February. That survey was based on responses from 1,657 California adult residents. It was a 14-minute survey. It took roughly about a week to 10 days, which is typical of our surveys, to complete. A word about the knowledge panel, which is what Ipsos uses. What Ipsos has done, and that survey, by the way, our surveys are done in English and Spanish, according to respondents' preferences. So the knowledge panel members have been recruited through a probability-based sampling and include both those with and without internet access. There are in the national sample about 60,000 people who are in the knowledge panel, and about representing about 50,000 households. So it's the largest probability-based online panel that's available in the U.S. And obviously, with a sample that size, we have a very sizable sample from California to select from. So for those people who don't have internet access, they're given internet access. For those who don't have a device to use to record their responses, they're given a device when they join the knowledge panel. All of that, allows us to get to a representative sample. The knowledge panel recruitment is originally based on was originally based on a national RDD frame, but then moved over time to include households with landlines and cell phones, and uses ABS, address-based sampling methodology for the recruitment. So all of those issues around recruitment are handled by Ipsos, as well as the data collection for us. Panel members are 18 or older, residents in California of our survey. To give you an example of what it's like to do online panels as opposed to RDD, random digit dial live telephone interviews, which was our previous method. So from the 1,657 adult residents who were in our final sample, there were a total of 1,724 respondents who completed the survey. And that was out of 2,846 panelists who were sampled and sent the survey in advance. So the response rate for our survey, our latest survey was 61%. It's typically over 50%. Those of us who've worked with RDD sampling know what the response rates can be in comparison. So there's obviously a big difference in online. Now, the reason that we don't take all the respondents who completed the survey is that what happens with online panels is that some people speed through the survey. And they speed through the survey to the extent that we flag those respondents and feel that, if they completed it, what is typically a 14-minute survey in 4 minutes, that we're not going to consider that as part of our final sample. Um, these surveys are also obviously at the end of the day, even though there's a pretty good response rate, not necessarily representative of the adult population, which is what we're after. So we work with Ipsos to make sure that the sample is weighted, and in our case, weighted it in terms of region of the state, age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, and income, with the known characteristics of the California population based on the American Community Survey and other data we have. And then we also weight the data according to voter registration for those people who are registered to vote. We choose to have a sample the size that we have because we want to have not just an adequate sample with a relatively low margin of error of around 3% for the total sample, but so that the samples for key groups across income, education, age, region, political affiliation are large enough that we can look at the crosstabs and draw meaningful comparisons between subgroups of the population. That's how we arrive at the sample of around 1,600, so that we can then present the results, as you'll see in our crosstabs, by region, by voters and non-voters, by race and ethnicity, and demographic characteristics. Also, last but not least, for us at least, always important to have some questions from national surveys for points of comparison, both for methodological reasons as well as for reasons to see in what ways California residents can be different from others. Happy to answer other questions about the methodology and results of the survey. And once again, wanted to be brief so that we would have some time for question and answer before our session ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just a quick question, and then I'll go through a number of the ones that are on the screen that our panelists have been able to see. Does the economic conditions survey tell you much about the changing nature of work in the way that Ed described it and the Labor Lab works on, whether it's circumstances of employment or job security or hours or any of that sort of thing?
Yeah, and the nice thing about, as my colleagues know about annual surveys, is you get to see changes over time. This one in particular, which launched during the pandemic, has been interesting. But we have surveys that are either roughly 16 minutes or 19 minutes in length, so that the economic well-being survey being a longer survey, and in particular having an oversample that has 1,000 lower income Californians gives us a lot of good information about that.
Great, thank you. Todd, a couple questions for you, that some of which have directly related to your presentation. You mentioned mental health as one of the topics in the CHIS, and we got a question asking a little more about what that means. Can you briefly tell us?
I think that first question came in actually during Ed's presentation.
Yeah, it did, but I was struck by your slide that mentioned it.
Sure. So in the CHIS, we do ask a number of questions about mental health, both We ask the K6,
One answer.
the Kessler-6 scale, as well as the repeated K6, to assess indications of serious psychological distress in the past 12 months. We also ask about need for treatment, access to treatment. We have a series of questions about suicidality, ideation, and attempts. And we've had other subtopics to that kind of come and go as different funders have asked about it. So we had, for example, some questions on social media use and sleep and its impact on mental health for adolescents that was on the survey for a while. So there's a little variety that comes with each cycle of CHIS.
Thank you. And Ed was telling me on the side here that there are some similarities in the types of, but maybe not as much detail in the kind of mental health questions in the work and health survey. A question for anybody. Cell phones have area codes based on where people were when they got the phone and they move. Are the sampling frames based on the area codes of cell phones or on the geographic location of where people are at the time you're surveying them, or something else even more?
If you mute yourself, I'll answer.
Okay, Ed's going to answer first.
We lost you, Ed?
I'm sorry, 1 minute. Go ahead.
I'll do it.
All right. 1 minute.
Maybe after answering this question, I'll just answer from Victor's computer so we don't have these transfer problems. We have listings of cell phones that are area codes, but are we include a separate sample of people with, say, area code 415, San Francisco, but who live elsewhere. And we have the reverse is what I meant, is that we know where people reside. This list knows where they reside, even though they may have a New York City area code. So we also have a question at the outset in our screener about where they live and screen out people who aren't living in California.
That's consistent with CHIS as well.
Same for what Ipsos does.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll
Just
leave. Sorry.
all right.
I'm just going to answer
yeah.
from yours.
With the rise of phishing scams, how are you addressing phishing concerns with sending links via a text to ask people to fill out personal information? Anyone want to reply to that? We have 2 minutes left. Huh?
Well, in our current text messaging experiment that we're doing, it's based on the sample address. I would assume that because of phishing scams, individuals may be less likely to respond to that text message, which is why we experimented with it to measure its effectiveness. And yeah, we're finding it does have limited effectiveness when we've already sent a series of 4 mailings to the household. But we are seeing increased effectiveness in that prepaid cell phone group as a first contact for them. But yeah, individually, I'm sure many of us are very hesitant to respond to anything in an unsolicited text message. So it
Yeah.
obviously is a reality.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why not just PPIC, but a number of other organizations have moved to online panels where people are recruited to be on a panel. So they know if they're getting a message from Ipsos to do a survey, or from NORC, or from YouGov, that they know who they're dealing with.
Yeah. Really briefly, and this will be our last question, Todd. Do you have MENA in the Middle Eastern North African category? And have you had any experience with indigenous languages? The very low turnout in Kern and Imperial reminded me that those are places where lots of non-Spanish speaking immigrants have resided.
So In 2025, we implemented the revised SPD 15 2024 standards, which does have a separate Middle Eastern North African category and subcategories presented. It is slightly different than what AB 91 requires for state agencies to produce. CHIS is exempt from that requirement because our funding is a blend of state and non-state sources, but we are following the federal guidelines for that. But it does include the spirit of AB 91 in the disaggregation for different Middle Eastern North African subgroups in our data, as well as a collection of other specified responses. But if you're looking at existing CHIS data out there, for the last several years, we have tabulated we've set a MENA flag based on their responses to the SPD 15 1997 standard format of race and ethnicity. So we do, based on their write-in responses, if they indicate a MENA origin, we set a different variable as a MENA yes or no. So you can analyze GIST data in that context. Yeah, the indigenous languages are something that we acknowledge is, a need, but we have to prioritize our resources on CHIS based on prevalence of linguistic isolation within households. And if you aggregate all of the indigenous languages together, they would probably rise to the threshold, but individual indigenous languages, each don't meet the threshold for us to make the financial investment necessary to be able to support each one individually. So
Thank
currently,
you.
we are not supporting those languages.
Thank you. And that's actually, and unfortunately, all the time we have. I think you have all done a tremendous job to show how you've adapted to changing circumstances and become very and maintained the excellence of all of these surveys and moved into this new age. And we, like Mark suggested, we encourage attendees to go to the websites for the Work and Health Survey, the California Health Interview Survey, and the PPIC surveys to learn more. So thank you very much. And Michelle, back to you.
Thank you for everyone for joining us today. Be on the lookout for your post-course certificate. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon.